Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our second installment of the Gospel in Black and White. We are so excited to greet you and say hello to you. I am here, of course, with my good friend, the Reverend Jeff Nelson, who, by the way, just celebrated a birthday. So make sure you say happy birthday to Pastor Jeff in the chat. And we just wish him all the best and all the joy that comes with life. So happy birthday, my good friend.
Thank you, Pastor.
And let me tell you.
51, my friend.
That's all?
That's it.
You're just a youngin'.
That's it. That's it.
So listen, we are certainly, we feel so excited about your excitement in this series. And we both want to thank you for the way that you have been in communication with us. And letting us know how you have enjoyed the conversation. And that's what this pretty much is. This is the brainchild of Pastor Jeff, the Gospel in Black and White. And we're looking at it through the lens of John, the Gospel according to John, the fourth Gospel. So, yeah.
It is good to be back doing this together, and we remind everyone who's kind of checking in with us tonight, if you have any questions, please just make those available in the chat. I'm going to give our shout out to Marcus behind the camera tonight, helping us make this work, and shout out to Joanna, who's back in the home office in Royal Oak, who's recording this live for our podcast, that we'll be able to launch this podcast, these sessions later in a podcast form, once we've completed them. So thanks to all of those who helped make this happen. We are blessed to be surrounded by some talented people, right?
Absolutely, no doubt about it.
Well, Kevin, last time we talked about something that needs to keep coming back to, and this is this idea that we talked about last time, that the logos, the justice, the word, this idea of God's goodness, God's reality has been with us from the beginning, from the beginning of creation, that John is retelling the Genesis story, that this idea of God's goodness, God's wholeness, God's fullness, God's justice has been with us since the dawn of creation. It's the idea that undergirds it. And then we said something unique that Jesus says, or John says about Jesus, is that there comes this moment when this universal idea became flesh. And it became real. It became embodied. And it lived among us. It put up its tent and resided with us. It moved into the neighborhood and was a part of what we're doing. One of the things that we talked about last time that's really important for us to hang in here as we talk about John, really as we talk about the Bible ever, talk about theology, is if to be Christian in theology means that your theology must be embodied, right? It must be incarnate. Exactly. It must take on flesh.
That's exactly right.
It must enter into time and culture and place. And remind us as what's dangerous, what happens when theology is not embodied, when it doesn't become enfleshed, when it's just ideas, when it doesn't become real. What happens?
Well, I think that is really what John is all about, actually. Just to pinpoint what you're speaking of. If you're not careful, this gospel can come off so subjective and so highly divine. That,
it's one of the reasons I didn't like it for a long time. I stayed away from John. John was too up here for me until I understood incarnation.
Even on the cross, he speared on the side and there's water. There's this sense of that this is a highly, highly divine Christ. Arguably to some in the ancient church, more divine than human, okay? But nevertheless, what is clear is the light comes into the darkness, I believe. And these are tangible things. These are things we feel, see, experience. And this light that comes into the darkness illuminates a lot of stuff. And it illuminates what the possibilities are, but it also invites us into this light, to walk into the light, to live into the light. So in the Black church, we sing this song, Jesus is the light of the world. We'll walk in the light. We'll live in the light, the beautiful light. When I was growing up, that song would get a church really started. But it's clear that this light counteracts, if not discontinues to some degree, darkness. This is not what we have to do. And I think to do real theological work is to do the work of eliminating darkness, which means we have to do the self-reflection of our own participation in it.
Yes.
We have to do the self-reflection of our own involvement in it, our complicity in it. So I think a Johannine Christian is one who does the work constantly of self-examination and who makes sure that we are accepting the invitation that Christ comes to give us. And what is this invitation? It is the invitation to believe that he is central, not doctrine.
Right, preach.
Right.
Now you're talking what I'm talking about.
It is the invitation to
that Jesus is central.
Jesus,
the person of Jesus.
We are the person of Jesus. We are invited to believe in him fully, completely, and holistically. And all through John, we will run into this word believe. I have come that you might believe. These things have been said so that you might believe. He did this so that they could come to believe. Do you believe these things? Whosoever believes in me shall not. So this is a key central word, I think, in John's gospel. And it's what really calls us. Do you believe? Now believe in what? And I know you didn't. Do you believe in what, though? What does Jesus bring to us?
Right.
Jesus brings us the invitation to become one.
And that, if we're going to get to that, I mean, I don't know if we're going to get to it in these 5 weeks, but that's where this gets to,
He doesn't
right?
tolerate division.
No.
And when
we have to become like.
Yes, we do.
Like.
That's right.
That they would be one like the Father and I are one.
Exactly. Right. And we will be known by this.
Right.
By our love for one another, which is unified and solidified by, our one with each other. So
that's how we get fired up in restaurants right about now. That's where they start to kick us out, man. We get excited.
Yes.
And the reason that matters so much to me is because kind of the way that the European colonialism that was fueled by kind of church and this idea of manifest destiny was a disembodied faith. It was a faith of doctrine, not of the person of Jesus.
Right.
And I remember in seminary, as we learned about that kind of the way that the church was involved and in the spread and the kind of way that it went hand in hand with European conquest into the New World and all of that kind of stuff. I ran into this guy named Bartolome de las Casas. I don't know if you ever heard of him, but he was a Franciscan monk who was sent here to go along with to be a missionary who went along with the conquerors, the explorers, but the conquerors, along with Cortez and all these people came to Central America and took over indigenous people. And it was Las Casas who wrote back and said that what we are doing to indigenous people in the name of Jesus is actually harming the witness of Jesus.
Wow, yeah.
And he was the first kind of European to start to say that it is not enough to just have the name of Jesus if the way of Jesus is divorced from it.
Right.
And that's why incarnation is so important.
Yep.
Right? He said, what good is it to baptize somebody if in doing so we drowned their body?
Exactly, right? Exactly. And I think the thing to be cautious of, and I've actually been kind of wrestling with this in my own life, in my own space, in my own leadership, we have to be very careful that we don't do the mechanics of religion.
Oh.
And I think this is what John Wesley meant about his worry that the Methodists in America would have the functionality of religion without the power, right? And I think in the Pharisees and Sadducees, and so much of what we do is living into the functionality of it, but there's something missing. And I think this is what Jesus brings to this conversation. He is the element missing. And when he is no longer the centerpiece, and when he is no longer the force that drives the movement, but drives the movement to what though? And that is drive the movement to love. For God so loved the world. God so loved the world. This is John's Jesus, the only gospel that gives us this statement. John 3:16, for God so loves the world. And it's impossible, seemingly, to claim Christ when we only love fractions of the world. And that, I think that's kind of, just from my vantage point, that's where we suffer. To give you a point, we've had this. Have you seen the debate about the Little Mermaid?
Yes. Tell us what's going on with the Little Mermaid right now.
The Little Mermaid is, people are outraged about a black girl portraying this character. I was talking to a friend of mine today who was telling me that there's a white woman who said, I don't mind her being black, but why does she have to wear hair like that? And the first thing I wanted to say is, I get it, because that's kind of what it's like when there's a white Jesus on the wall, right? There's a white Jesus on the wall. And Marcus, I think you have a picture of, someone with a flag, and on the flag is the caricature or the portrayal of a Jesus who is clearly European. And again, I think to embody John's Jesus is not to just embody the idea, because that makes it incomplete. We have to embody the whole ethnic portion of it, the whole racial identity, the whole location geographically. This is not an American project.
Right.
I'm sorry. I love being in America. I love being an American, but this is not an American project. This is larger than America. The kingdom of God that comes into the world is larger than any one individual country.
You're getting some hearts and thumbs up over here right now. That's good.
It's larger than one individual country, or group of people, or a last name. And as a result, I think John's Jesus comes, and we'll get there the second half, I know, to reclaim the faith.
Well, he starts it today.
Yes, because John 1, we have poetry.
Big ideas.
John 2, this thing hits the road. This thing gets started.
It starts out personal, and then it gets public.
Yes, that's right.
It starts out personal, and it gets public. So if you have your word, turn in your word to in the book to John chapter 2. Kevin and I are going to work through this exciting piece of scripture together here tonight. First part of John 2 is a familiar story, although it's familiar, but I'll just be honest, like we always don't, at least in my tradition, we're not always sure how to preach this one, right? And as Methodists, Jesus has some wine around, and we just don't know what to do with that either. But here's what it says. On the third day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee. It's in a specific place, right?
Yep.
Cana of Galilee. And the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples, who had been invited to the wedding, when the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what concern is that of you and to me? My hour has not yet come." You got a there. What you thinking?
I'll tell you what I'm thinking. I think he is reluctant to trust his ministry in the context of either underdeveloped believers or believers who already feel they know the way. And he's reluctant to share this power in such a context. Because who's primarily the guest at this wedding?
Say some more.
You know, I think, and this is what you mean from the personal to public, I think this is a very close familial.
Yeah. These are his people.
These are his people.
Family members.
Family members. And was he not related to John the Baptist?
Yeah, cousins.
They were cousins. So it's highly possible that the followers of John are also at this wedding, among other people. And they're kind of in their own place, and you know, they're obviously following John. And then there were no doubt Jewish people there from the synagogue and well established. And it's kind of awkward for Jesus to unleash all of this power on people who have had no preparation to receive it.
Just wasn't time yet.
Which is what, it's not time.
But what happens when your mother's there?
When your mother's there.
We got some mothers listening in tonight who'll be like, right?
Yep.
Woman, what concern is that to you and me? My hour has not yet come. But his mother said to the servants, do whatever he tells you. Now standing there were 6 stone water jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to them, fill the jars with water. And they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, now draw some out and take it to the chief steward. So he took it. When the steward tasted the water, it had become wine, and he did not know where it came from, though the servants who drawn the water knew. The steward called the bridegroom and said to him, everyone serves the good wine first, and then the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk. But you kept the good wine until now. Jesus did this, the first of his signs in Cana of Galilee, right? And he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him.
What happened?
They believed.
He revealed his glory and his disciples believed, which is, in my opinion, the whole centralized purpose of John. And I think this whole story is fascinating.
Yeah, what's going on here for you?
One is, here's a couple, and see, these weddings during this period were a week long.
Right.
You know, we stress out over one day.
No, it's a full week.
It's a week long worth of celebration, which means there's a lot of eating and there's a lot of drinking.
A lot of expense.
And a lot of expense.
Right.
And I think the fear is that the couple who runs out of resources, be it wine or food, starts their marriage off in a deficit. They start their marriage off, ill-equipped. And the concept might be, the symbolism of it might be, that they're beginning their lives in such a way that there's not enough to sustain them. You know, so to run out of wine at a wedding was pretty traumatic, embarrassing. It was embarrassing, shameful.
Beyond embarrassment, the way we would think of it, it would have been a public shame.
It would have been a public shame, and Jesus begins his ministry.
And that would have spread.
And Jesus begins his ministry rescuing someone from public shame.
Public shame. That's going to come up again later, right?
Jesus begins his ministry. In John's gospel.
Think about that, my friends, right? Jesus's beginning is delivering people from being publicly shamed, or people who didn't deserve. Because in a minute, he's going to do some public shame here in a minute institutional shame.
Yeah.
Yeah, but this personal
Yes.
shame, he's going to go right into that right from the beginning. And that's where I think this is interesting, this little detail that we lost on us, right?
Yep.
It says that he took the jars, right? 6 of them, 20 to 30 gallons each. And it says that these jars were for a specific purpose. What purpose were those for? For the Jewish rite of purification. Right, it says right in there.
Originally
right?
for water, right?
Right. There were stone water jars for the Jewish rite of purification.
Yep.
Right. And what is that? What was the kind of sense of that way that you weren't clean enough?
You were not whole enough.
You weren't. You bore shame on you all the time. That you couldn't wash it off. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And if I remember right, in turning these jars could only be used for that.
Right.
Anything else that those jars got used for, the jars were no longer able to be used.
Right.
Right? So here comes
Tainted.
Jesus along and into this 130 gallons of shame. Right? 130 gallons of shame, 130 gallons of us consistently trying to be worthy of God's goodness and grace. Jesus takes those containers and the shame within them and transforms them into wine.
Wow.
And what is the symbolism of wine in the entire scripture? Wine is the good stuff.
The good stuff.
The best stuff.
The best stuff.
The joy, the grace.
And it also becomes
the abundance.
The symbolism for life anew.
Right.
You know, for salvation.
Later it becomes we go gather around the table and Jesus took the cup of wine and said, this good stuff, it's my stuff, right?
Which never runs out.
Never runs out.
This is what we get this. The blood never loses its power. And we get that concept. Friends, I want to just take a quick second to welcome all of you again. I noticed that we have a little bit of traffic in the YouTube room, but that's okay. Be encouraged and continue to feel free to ask us any questions or any thoughts. Those of you who are in the Facebook Live room and those of you who are in the YouTube room, and we'll try to intercept those throughout our time together.
So that sense that right from the beginning, Jesus is going to go right into the heart of this religion that's shame-based.
Right.
Boy, and just think of how, man, we are still dealing with that. I know we are in like mainline, not so much in mainline Christianity, but in the kind of evangelical Christianity that I came back through. Like you were never holy enough to be in the presence of God. You were a sinner. You know, that was the first thing of the 4 spiritual laws. Like you just carry that burden. Or I think some of our Catholic brothers and sisters for whom that burden of guilt and shame, they just carry with them. And here from the get-go, Jesus says, okay.
What you know what I find interesting here is the 10th verse. Mm-hmm. And I think the 10th verse almost gives a reason why there's reluctance. Everyone serves the good wine first, and then the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk.
What you getting at?
I think it's a form of elitism, misappropriation of resources. And I think this method and this model exposes those who can't afford it, exposes those who are behind and left out. You know, and you know, I think the idea is these weddings, you serve the good wine first so that, you know, your upper echelon of guests get the best product. And this is, you know, this conversion is taken to the chief priest, to the chief or the host, if you will. And he'd never tasted wine like that before. And his mind, you know, he's like, wait a minute, most everybody gives this thing out at the beginning. And they're drunk and they're done. And the less fortunate, the lowest of the guests get the leftovers. You mean to tell me that you saved the best wine for last? Which I think is what the gospel is all about for John.
It's what the whole Bible's about,
It's
right?
what the whole
Flips
Bible
it upside
is
down
about.
all the time. Like
It's a reordering of creation.
Resetting our expectation.
And making room at the table to get rid of these notions of better and better than. And this is us. I think John's Jesus has issues with the pairing of phrases, us and them. You know, they over there, we're over here. That is contrary to God's plan for community.
So Kevin, sometimes I think the church that we serve, the denomination we serve, thinks that the best wine is all gone.
Wow.
Right? That we feel like it's the third day of the party, third day, we're midway through. 50 years ago, this denomination was powerful and full, and the wine was plentiful. And,
wow.
And what's it going to mean for us to invite Jesus now to change all of our shame into joy again? And what is I don't want to sound too too white, but there's a lot of conversation in kind of academic stuff as you're studying, as I'm trying to be more anti-racist, about this kind of unique thing that the black church has always brought is joy. This thing, there's this phenomenon that we just catching on to, this thing called black joy. That's different. Like, so I don't know. Maybe this is one of these moments you can be like, you're just being too white, and that's okay.
Well, no, I mean, I think this is why even people from Africa during the slave trade, when they heard the gospel, I mean, these are people who were deep in Yorubic faith, Islamic faith, what have you. When they heard the gospel, they had a special identification with Jesus. It was something about the person of Jesus in the context of their slavery. Even when they heard Jesus being talked about from a white preacher, they realized that this Jesus they were hearing about was a friend of theirs. He was a connection to them. They felt that he understood their plight. He understood where they were. And he gives them a purpose. We are in so many different ways. They will understand what it means to really be at the precipice of the greatest moment of your life, and for resources to be thin, and for everybody to be looking in, waiting for it to fail. They understand what it means to be in such vulnerable space and time. They understand what it means for Jesus to come in at the last moment and save the day. And I think, in terms of a conversation around Black theology, that's what the substance of joy becomes. Come what may, Jesus will show up.
The great antidote to shame.
Yes.
Joy is, right? Joy. And
being seen.
Say some more.
And being seen. Mary makes this intervention and kind of puts Jesus on the spot. And he cannot, though reluctant, he could not pass up the opportunity. He could not let these people go with such great need. And he was not going to lend these people without power and resource. He saw them.
Oh, I like that.
And I think that's the power of Jesus, to see.
And can we find the ways when we see people to bring them their dignity and joy? And sometimes all it takes is finding the good wine.
Yes.
And bringing it out. Sometimes all it is, at Royal Oak First, we do a lot of feeding with our local hungry and people experiencing homelessness. And sometimes it's doing a different meal. Mm-hmm. Like instead of we work really hard. COVID has shifted us a little bit. We've been outside for the last 2 years, but prior to that, we brought that ministry inside, and we had a table setting, and we made sure that there was it felt like a cafe, that people were there and had choices and had dignity. And they experienced joy in the midst of that.
Wow.
And the meal wasn't just something we threw together. We'd have steak night, or we'd do.
So these were your guests.
Yeah, and we'd bring out the good stuff, and trying to constantly remind ourselves that dignity maybe doesn't change the world,
right? But
it changes the moment,
right?
And right here. This is Jesus' first sign.
And this is what
it didn't change the world, but it changed their world.
And you know what we call it?
What do we call it?
Embodiment.
Embodiment. The word became flesh.
Right there.
And it dwelt among us.
Right there.
Right?
Right there.
Now, anybody got any questions about weddings? How do you like as a pastor of weddings? How many have you done probably in your career?
I have no idea. 25, 26 years. How long have I been doing this? I would say 300.
Yeah, probably even more, I bet. I'm over 4.
You're over 400?
You got a few more years in this than I do. In fact, this Saturday, and I saw she was on here listening. Jenny, if you're still listening, this is what Christian joy looks like. We're doing Jenny's wedding to Dan. Jenny's wedding to Dan this year was scheduled actually for June, but Jenny's dad, Mark, he's at the end. Mark isn't going to make it to June, and Jenny saw what time it was, and so we moved everything to get we went from planning a wedding in 8 months to planning a wedding in 4 weeks.
Wow.
In order to make sure that Mark had a chance to drink the good wine.
Wow.
On the way out there. Mark had a chance to walk his daughter down the aisle.
Yep.
Right? That Mark had a chance to be there. And I won't be able to escape what we talked about now that we're there, that we aren't going to skimp on the joy.
Yeah.
Right? We just aren't going to skimp on the joy.
Yeah.
And weddings, for all the packaging around them, man, there's just these moments I always remind people at a wedding that we see the love of God on display, because 2 people become 1 and yet remain 2. and there's more love in the world. But not only that, two families become one, two groups of friends become one, and in those moments when we see interracial couples marrying, we see two cultures can become one.
Yes.
And in support of each other, they get behind these people they love. And I always remind people, like for a minute tonight, we are just going to be in the unification love of God.
Right.
This covenant, this no matter whatness.
Right.
It's truly a sign.
Well, it's of life. Of newness of life, because what has happened now is I think we're at a day where we're normalizing division.
Yeah.
So these, for example, these ecumenical weddings, these interracial weddings, interfaith weddings are now awkward because of what the world, or at least what some in America has deemed as inappropriate, and in some cases out of alignment with created order. We're almost turning back, and forgive me for using this language, and even that filter is out of being politically correct, but we're going back to a day of fundamental reading of text, a fundamentalist reading of text. And we're almost being biblicist as opposed to being persons who are really tapping into what John, by the way, says. John's Jesus, I came that you may have a life and have it abundantly. And I think some of us are reading it now where only some of us are supposed to have life. And only some of us are supposed to have abundance. And only some of us are allowed to have this level of access. Only some of us are allowed to be angry. Only some of us are allowed to carry. Only some of us are allowed to experience breakdowns and fits. But everybody else, not so much. And so what is emerging, and you talk to me and tell me, what it looks like is emerging is a force of white supremacist thought. And let me say, the concept of racism now is really participating in a mentality and in a thought process that allows you to feel superior over others. And this is the notion of supremacy. And I think supremacy is being normalized. You won't have a country anymore if you don't fight. But who was out there in that crowd that day? You won't have a country anymore. Who won't have a country anymore? Exactly. There are these hidden messages that is uplifting white power. And as a result, it's angering and it's raising hatred and danger and fury and violence. And so this type of wedding, quite frankly, I think is countercultural to American society today. If they ran out of wine, it's because they didn't prepare. This is why we shouldn't have come to this wedding in the first place. And nobody has a conversation about the opportunities that this couple may have or may not have to even make such purchases, but they deserve a celebration as well. So Jesus again comes and he becomes the celebration. Not because of what he does entirely, but because who he is in his context and how he begins to usher in a kingdom where the underprivileged are recognized and seen. I cut you off. I didn't want to do
We had a question here from Reggie White. He says, we operate as though the best wine is gone. How do you rid yourself of the mindset of scarcity? To which Katie responded, I do believe the lesson of the wine allows us to trust Jesus to work miracles on our behalf, to have faith in his timing, that he won't allow us to go without. Jesus supplies all our needs beyond ourselves. How about that mindset of scarcity, man? We're living in it. The last 2 years, man, it felt like everything got scarce.
Well, our own wedding we've been living in a depleted wedding of sorts the past 2 years, no doubt about that. But even then, the Lord has provided. So, I think it's important to be mindful of the sociological constructs. Let me say it this way. John's gospel is about a Jesus interacting with several communities. Jesus interacts with the Jews who are considering belief in him, who are seeing miracles right before their eyes. I think Jesus is interacting with Jews who have become Christians but remain so in secret. I think Jesus is interacting with the synagogue community that in his mind has abandoned the God agenda. I think Jesus is interacting with the disciples of John throughout the text. And in the 4th chapter, I think Jesus is interacting with the Samaritans. And all of these communities are being invited to cross the street.
To get to the other side.
And meet him and take on his cause, which is God's cause. But this is a hard...
You and I are one.
That's it.
And the world will believe it when they see it.
And this is not the Jesus we're working for today. This is not the Jesus. John's Jesus would run into problems with some of the rhetoric in America today. And I think the Christian responsibility, the faithful disciples of Christ, is to rescue the gospel.
Well, preacher, we got about 15, 20 minutes left. Take us to the second scene. It's really interesting. In John's gospel, we forget that what we're about to read happens at the beginning. Jesus comes to the temple at the beginning. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the temple, the turning of the tables is a culminating moment for Jesus. In John, it is an initiating experience. So let's read that for each other here. I'm starting with verse 13 to the end of the chapter, and then let's dig into a little bit about this scene, because it's...
John 2:13 and following. The Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and the money changers seated at their tables. Making a whip of cords, he drove all of them out of the temple, both the sheep and the cattle. He also poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. He told those who were selling the doves, "Take these things out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." The Jews then said to him, "What sign can you show us for doing this?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "This temple has been under construction for 46 years, and will you raise it up in 3 days? But he was speaking of the temple of his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken.
Don't you think it's funny that people just don't get metaphor?
Especially in John's gospel. They stayed confused in John's gospel.
It's okay.
They never got it.
Every once in a while in the sermon, you're like, it was a metaphor.
Right. They never got it.
Hey, but we're back to this thing. We go from private wedding to public demonstration. not even the flip of a page. What is going on? We go from private to public, right? What's going on here? And that is a quick move.
Yeah, well,
Fast.
I think you mentioned it from a redaction perspective that this story is placed pre-crucifixion in the synoptics, primarily because this is what really got him killed. Okay? All right, let's be clear. You turning over money, you messing with the temple's money now. All right, you don't get to do that. So, but I think John wants to start the controversy initially, not as a chronological concept, but to lay down the stress and the tension that Jesus engages in here. So I think, this is, again, one of these scenarios where Jesus is interacting with a community. And I like to think about communities when it comes to John. Each of these conflicts are for a particular group of people. The community here is the synagogue and his complete disregard for what has become their ethos and their foundational
And what is it based on?
Of existence. So it has become institutionalized and a big business while people are dying. Coming off of this wedding, even, if we were to look at it this way, very interesting that all of this is in chapter 2. And I don't think it's any disconnect here. Coming off of this wedding, pouring into a synagogue scenario, I think he's on fire and impassioned about his ministry going public now, after seeing how there was transformation in the personal realm. Now we have to bring the transformation in the realm where transformation is supposed to happen, but has not happened in years.
Jesus is interested in transforming institutions?
Well, I think he's reclaiming the house. My Father's house is supposed to be...
We comfortable with Jesus at the wedding. I tell you, my folks don't know what to do with angry Jesus flipping tables in the church. Man, we white folk get really weirded out by angry Jesus. We just don't know what to do with him. We just don't know what, and that's a
yeah. You don't know what to do with a Jesus that has an attitude.
No, we like meek, mild, hang out the party, make the wine, hang out with the children. We get even a little queasy when he protects the lady from getting stones thrown at her. We get it, but man, Jesus is showing up in the middle of public worship and making a scene.
Yes.
Yes. Well, I mean, Christianity in my culture is all about not making a scene.
Yep. Yep.
Being proper.
Yep.
Even if you got a problem with it, write a letter, go to the meeting. Jesus makes a public witness.
It's embarrassing. Now, so check it out. The first half of the gospel, the couple has been able to avoid shame and embarrassment. The second half, the temple has been thrust into it.
No, right?
Right.
Where should shame be pointed? At people? At couples? I mean, and think about that
and the behavior.
Think about that we back up the last story, but think about that in the context of shame and couples getting married right now in our church.
Yes.
Get the shame off them.
Right.
Right? Get the shame off them.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Into this moment of institution. I was thinking about this, Kevin, on the way over. When Dr. King wrote his letter from the Birmingham jail after public protests, he's writing that to me, to white pastors like me, who want to be supportive, but are afraid.
Be neat about it.
Yeah. I mean,
don't kick up so much fuss.
He wrote that letter to me and to pastors like me.
Yeah.
Who were like, like there comes a moment.
Do you know who was on the list? The reason he had to write the letter is because there was a letter before that from white clergy.
Telling them to chill out.
2 of them were Methodist bishops.
Yeah.
One was a Methodist pastor.
Telling them we support you, but chill out.
Calm
Give it
down.
time.
You're causing trouble.
Yeah.
And by the way, these Methodists were upstanding, very respectable men. I don't mean.
No, I am too.
I don't mean.
And you might have to write me a letter to get me to, because it's so culturally conditioned.
Yeah.
In my culture, to behave.
Right.
To be good.
Right.
Right. To not kick up a fuss.
Right.
Do not make a scene. Especially church is a civilizing thing, right? It's supposed to,
Well, I went to see Chris Rock. Right, and he was talking about the Will Smith interaction.
Yeah.
So some of them were asking, he said, Chris, why didn't you hit Will Smith back? And his reply was, well, because I was raised right, but you don't fight in front of white people. You don't fight in front of white people because they already think we're barbaric.
Yeah.
So I think there's that tension. So there's a cultural, what you're pointing out is just a cultural theme of neat and order, even at the expense of misappropriating the gospel.
Well, let's take a minute and unpack for just a second the purpose. In the beginning of this, there's a real clear indicator what Jesus is aiming his rage at, his frustration, his protest at. And it's this, in the temple, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and the money changers seated at the table. Kevin, remind us, what is the temple culture and what was the sacrificial system all about?
Well, this is Passover.
Yeah.
This is during Passover, and these were souvenirs in a regard, but the other thing is you get to buy your offering and present it. You don't have to. It's you go to these events and there are tables of T-shirts and the Aretha Franklin funeral T-shirts. I was at the funeral. It's the same kind of concept, and these things were purchased, but they weren't a product. And correct me if I'm wrong. They weren't a product of genuine sacrifice and offering. And it was something sacrilegious about it, But the temple didn't care. They didn't care where how you got it.
We see this other moment of public shame, right? There is a stratification of sacrifice here.
Yeah.
Cattle, certain economic bracket could afford the cattle. Certain economic bracket could afford the sheep. Certain economic could afford the dove. And if you read Luke's gospel, when Jesus' parents came to dedicate him, what did they bring? They brought doves.
Right.
Jesus knows the public shame of having to walk in and declare your offering not as economically sufficient.
And what did he do here?
He ended that.
Well, and he got rid of these items for sale.
Yeah. Right?
Now what's left?
That are the money changers.
But now that I can't buy my offering, now I can't buy my sacrifice, what is left? Me.
I'm going to tear this down, and what's going to be left? Me.
Because people. Getting back to the centralization of Jesus as what this thing is all about. Not our doctrine, not our political stand, not what political party we're in. Are we central enough? Are we Christ-centered enough to carry out the faith?
Kevin, you talked for just a minute. We're probably going to go about 5 minutes long tonight because this is too good to set down too early. And we're right on the cusp of something really important.
Yeah.
I just confessed the overall kind of white church's reluctance about public demonstration. Like we gotten better at it over the years, but it's not our thing. What is that meant in the African American context? This kind of sense of showing up at institutions and pointing out what's happening.
Well, I think the genius of this was honestly Martin Luther King, who brought significant and deep meaning to.
He's got a good picture here showing us.
To protest. Protest number one was a peaceful expression. It was in the black context and the modern civil rights movement.
We're showing Selma here on the screen.
Yep. We had opportunities to not tear down and destroy, but to raise the conscience of a people and to raise awareness of a people who wanted to be free. This is not exactly, and a lot of people are trying to equate, for example, January 6th, and you know.
How does that image look different there, Marcus? What did the 6th look like? They're hard to look at least they are for me.
Yeah.
Because they're shaming.
Yeah, and I think here you have Christian nationalists who are honestly, it's almost a cult of sorts. You know, they're honestly angered. They've been encouraged to really commit acts of violence. They had guillotines out there. They had, they were weaponized, and they were willing to do whatever they could to take the country back. And this was often done in the name of Jesus. So the theological underpinning is God wants to bring traditional family and family values as they were in the 50s. We have to get back. So when we talk about taking America back, we're really not just taking America back, but we're talking about going back. And what Obama did, I think, and not without being too political, but what Obama did was brought a new vision for America.
Yeah.
That was arguably, in my opinion, very close to the vision that Christ sets in John's gospel here, or Christ's ministry period, where everybody's invited to the table. And you would hear Obama say things, if I could get here, that all things are possible in America. And now we have this backlash, which Martin Luther King called it backlash, the white backlash, to make sure that that never happens again. We're not getting a woman president. We have to take back the country. We have to take back the United Methodist Church. We have to take away rights. We have to take away abortion. We have to decide who can marry who. We even have to adjust historical record and story so that it might fit the white narrative. This is the tragedy that we are in. And I have no other word for it. Tragedy. How does it sit with you? What do you...
Well, and that's why we have to hang out with the historical. We cannot divorce Jesus from Jesus. I mean, we can't have Jesus in name and not Jesus embodied. Because the Jesus who showed up at the position of power, at the temple of power, that's our temple, that's our national temple of power. And let us not forget that the Jewish temple in Jerusalem is the Capitol building.
Yes.
It's the sign of national religious identity.
Yes.
Jesus shows up there on behalf of the poor.
Yes. Yep.
On behalf of the poor.
And not just on behalf of the poor, but as the poor.
Oh man, now we need to go home.
But as the poor. Lord have mercy. It's almost, he becomes those that are oppressed and liberates them from that place, you know.
Kevin, do you remember your first your first real demonstration?
Yes.
What were you doing?
1983, the 20th anniversary of the March on Washington. And the United Methodist Church was the first in the religious line. You know, they had lines of the churches, and Asbury Church, which, by the way, was the same church that had the vandalism on the Black Lives Matter piece, you know. That was the church where that centralized the United Methodist engagement at the March on Washington, 1983. That was my first protest. I grew up, of course, in D.C., and I grew up having to, my mom took me to all of these things, you know, so I am down for, you know, listen, I am down for the protests. I grew up with them, you know. That's just part of my upbringing. So I was 13 years old. That hot summer August day, 20th anniversary of the March on Washington. Some of you all might have even been there, Washington, D.C., 1983.
I was 20.
Some of y'all might have been at the 1963 March on Washington, right?
My first one is probably 1989, 1999. Was it? We were learning about, it was at Fort Benning, Georgia, and it was a national demonstration against the kind of training up of Central American guerrilla. This is called the School of the Americas, where we learned that a lot of the atrocities that were happening to poor people were happening by people trained at Fort Benning. And
wow.
So I was there as a part of a national protest. I remember we crossed onto the thing, and I'm like, oh man, this is getting real now. You know, but then they just put us on a bus and sent us home. And they're like, you nice white people, just go home. It's really nice to have you here. Thank you for showing up. Wow. It was good, but I remember that.
Yeah.
This has been fun again tonight.
It has.
I leave inspired by the first half and troubled by the second half, and I think that's what John had in mind. The personal Jesus and those giving people those moments of personal dignity and those human moments that matter, and seeing them and recognizing when people need a moment, when their moment needs to be recognized, when dignity and joy. But then understanding that same joy has to be systematized.
And I just can't help but to think, if I were there, perhaps as one who could only buy a dove, and here comes someone that just turns all of that
For
over.
that day, everybody just got to go.
Everybody got to
Just
go.
opened it up.
But I want to be a part of that. I want to be a part of that. I want to be a part of a faith where it's not based on what I bring, but what's brought to me.
Ooh. Put that on a bumper sticker, man.
I'm going to start preaching, so we better stop here.
Kevin, I remember at my last church when Susie showed up with her 7 kids and told me about the 3 more that were on the way, 3 more that were at home and the 1 more that was on the way, and had all kinds of misconceptions about who Susie was. And then she brought Fred, her husband, to church a couple of weeks later. Now, we had the best Christmas pageant ever, because suddenly we had more angels than we knew what to do with. And you know, Fred said, the reason I'm worried about coming to church is I just need them all to know that every one of those 11 kids are mine. You right into our assumption. And then Fred and Susie journeyed with our church for 6 months, and they started to believe it. And I remember Fred coming to me and saying, Pastor, would it be all right if Susie and I got married here? He had convinced himself that the condition of his life no longer afforded him the good wine.
Wow.
That he had blown it. And he had come to a place where he was willing to risk, where his dignity had been seen. He was willing to raise his hand and say, is it possible that the thing that I believe I am not worthy of, that the shame that the culture has placed upon me and my family, is it possible that this church will stand with us in a moment of sign and goodness? And I was never more proud to be a pastor on that day, when that church not only opened its doors to this family who had become a part of our life. But the United Methodist Women took Susie shopping for her dress. And Claire got the kitchen open, and we had a potluck and took care of everything. And Jimmy did the DJing, and Susie did Carly's mom, I can't remember her name all of a sudden, Cindy's mom made the flowers. And not only did that church rise up and make sure that there was good wine, they enacted the banquet and made it happen. But it's back to that sense that sometimes, because of the cultural, economic, racial categories that we place people in, that they have come to convince themselves that they are no longer worthy to be invited to the party, no longer worthy of the good wine. And Jesus shows up into the midst of that moment and says,
and God forgive us when we, the church, assist in such an erroneous message.
And that's where he shows up later and says, we aren't going to do this anymore. And maybe he needed to go to that wedding before he went to the temple.
Yeah.
Maybe. I never thought of it that way.
Yeah, I think
And
so.
maybe he saw
He was
that.
fired up.
Yeah, maybe he saw that moment.
He's fired up, perhaps.
Kevin, we've kept people longer than we should have. We're 10 minutes over. So pass the offering plate and let's go home. Invite people back next 2 weeks from today.
2 weeks from today. We look forward to seeing you guys. Thank you so much for sojourning with us in these conversations. This has been a rich blessing. I'm glad you thought of the idea, had the vision to bring it, and we're having fun with it. So may the Lord bless you and keep you, and may God's face radiantly shine upon you and give you entrance into the synagogue and the church and wherever God may be found, with the confidence that you, my friend, are a child of God. We will see you next time. God bless.
All right, let's go get some new wine, Kevin.
Oh my gosh.
I know, I'm going to keep it interesting, don't I?
Yeah, I love it.
Thank you. That